Before we begin, please note that viewer discretion is strongly advised. The following is for educational and entertainment purposes only. What happens when the biggest mogul in hip-hop turns into your worst nightmare? Sean Diddy Combs, an icon of power, influence, and music, stands accused of darker deeds than we could ever have imagined. The world knows him for his legendary status in the industry, but what's happening behind the scenes is chilling. Could the empire of one of the most influential men in music be built on secrets too dark to imagine? From sex trafficking to drug-fueled parties and manipulative behavior, the truth is coming out, step by shocking step. In the world of high-powered moguls, few figures are as untouchable as Sean Diddy Combs. The music mogul has built an empire, leaving behind a trail of success, luxury, and influence. But what happens when the very foundation of that empire begins to crack? What happens when someone who knows it all, the secrets, the lies, the dark side of fame, decides to blow the whistle? That's where Brendan Paul comes in. Brendan Paul, a former assistant to Diddy, is the key whistleblower in this explosive trial. For the better part of 2 years, Paul was by Diddy's side, tasked with handling everything from music to the mogul's demanding personal needs. He was in the thick of it all, witnessing firsthand the life of one of the world's most famous men. But his role wasn't just a job, it was a lifestyle, one that was exhausting, toxic, and, as Paul would later testify, far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Paul wasn't just any assistant. He was part of Diddy's inner circle, working directly for the hip-hop mogul from late 2022 to early 2024. He had access to things most people could only dream of: luxurious properties, exclusive parties, and behind-the-scenes glimpses into Diddy's personal life. But along with those perks came something darker: the pressure to keep secrets, the manipulation, and, as Paul would later reveal, the disturbing things he was asked to do. Then came the life-changing decision. On the witness stand, Paul didn't hesitate. He came forward, granted immunity for his testimony, and made the difficult choice to speak the truth. He was no longer just a cog in the machine of Diddy's empire. He was a man who knew the risks and had chosen to expose them. In doing so, Paul gave up his own privacy, his sense of security, and the life he had been living behind the scenes. No longer was he just Diddy's assistant. He was now the person everyone would listen to, the one holding the key to the mogul's world of secrets. But why did Paul decide to testify? Was it for money, fame, or revenge? He answered that question clearly in court. It wasn't about that. It was about the truth, about taking responsibility for what he had seen and what he had done, even if it meant going against the man who had given him the opportunity of a lifetime. For years, Paul had been complicit, doing what was asked of him, no questions asked. But now, he was no longer willing to let his loyalty blind him to the truth. It was a decision that would change his life forever, a moment of clarity that came at the cost of everything he had worked for. And then, as the courtroom waited in suspense, Paul began to speak. The details of his time working for Diddy were nothing short of shocking. From the late nights, the grueling hours, to the bizarre and illegal demands made of him, Paul painted a picture of a world that no one could have imagined. A world of drugs, deception, and toxic loyalty. But the bombshells Paul would drop next would leave everyone in the courtroom stunned. Brendan Paul's time working for Sean Diddy Combs wasn't just a job, it was an unrelenting lifestyle. Imagine the demands of working for one of the most powerful men in entertainment, where the clock never stops and the expectations never end. For Paul, it wasn't about a typical 9 to 5. It was about living on the edge of exhaustion, constantly juggling tasks and responsibilities, all while trying to keep up with Diddy's demanding pace. Paul worked between 80 to 100 hours a week, numbers that seem almost impossible in any industry, but in the world of Diddy, they were just the beginning. Whether it was planning events, managing Diddy's personal life, or helping to execute his next big move, there was no such thing as off hours. Every moment, every minute was accounted for in the whirlwind that was Diddy's empire. And it wasn't just the long hours that took a toll, it was the relentless pressure that came with them. For Paul, the job was 24/7. The demands didn't stop after the clock hit midnight, and neither did Diddy's need for perfection. The assistant's role, no matter how menial, was a high-stakes game. If Diddy needed something, it was expected to be done, and done right, without question. The grueling hours came with sacrifices, too. Paul didn't just give up his weekends, he gave up his personal life. Family? Forget it. Relationships? They didn't exist in this world. The job wasn't just a job, it was all-consuming. Paul was constantly on call, always at Diddy's beck and call, whether he was in Los Angeles or Miami, or traveling somewhere else for work. If Diddy needed him, he had to be there, no matter what. There was no time to relax, no time to recharge. The pressures piled up, with every day being a new challenge. And while it might have seemed glamorous from the outside, the reality of it was anything but. For Paul, the job wasn't just exhausting, it was isolating. No weekends, no vacations, and no time to spend with loved ones. The 80 to 100-hour weeks were just the start of what made this job something most people couldn't even imagine. But it wasn't just the insane work schedule that made this job impossible. As if the unrelenting work hours weren't enough, Brendan Paul's testimony took an even darker turn when he began to describe the unsettling environment of drugs, power, and manipulation that permeated every corner of Diddy's life. What had started as a job filled with grueling demands soon turned into a nightmare of moral compromise and illegal activity. One of the most chilling parts of Paul's testimony was his description of Diddy's ongoing drug use. As an assistant, Paul had seen it all: the cocaine, ketamine, ecstasy, and marijuana. But what truly stood out was how the mogul's habits weren't just a secret indulgence. They were a central part of the culture that Diddy had cultivated around him. Paul wasn't merely witnessing the drug use from a distance, he was involved in it, directly and indirectly. There were moments when Diddy, with his characteristic drive and charisma, would ask Paul to go out and buy thousands of dollars worth of illicit substances, drugs that fueled not just personal pleasure but the high-octane lifestyle that Diddy lived. Cocaine, ecstasy, pink cocaine, ketamine, all of it. Paul had seen it all, and the requests were relentless. But it wasn't just about being an accomplice. The real danger came when Diddy tested his loyalty. During one of the many intimate, often tense moments, Diddy asked Paul to try the drugs, to take them himself. The words were simple: try it, prove your loyalty. For Paul, a young man eager to make a name for himself in the music industry, this was a test, a brutal, twisted test. And he took it. I didn't feel the full effect, Paul recalls, describing his brief experience with the drugs. But the important part wasn't the high, it was the underlying pressure. The expectation was that in order to survive in Diddy's world, Paul needed to prove himself, not just with his work ethic, but with his willingness to partake in the dark side of the lifestyle. The lines between right and wrong blurred as the demands mounted, and Paul, desperate to fit in, found himself caught in a web of manipulation. But even more shocking were the Wild King nights. But it wasn't just the drugs and the exhausting hours that made Brendan Paul's life working for Diddy so troubling. There was another side to this chaotic world, one that Paul never fully understood until he became deeply involved in the bizarre, dangerous, and morally questionable Wild King nights. These weren't your typical party scenes. They were something darker, events where drugs, alcohol, and sex collided in a reckless and extravagant display of excess. Paul didn't just observe these freak-offs, he played a crucial role in them. As part of his duties, he was tasked with organizing the entire event. These weren't casual get-togethers. They were elaborate affairs, designed to indulge Diddy's every whim. Paul recalls being responsible for procuring everything needed to set the mood: alcohol, drugs, condoms, incense, candles, even soup and lubricants. The list went on, growing more surreal with every detail. And it wasn't just the preparation that consumed him. After the wild nights, Paul's job was to clean up the aftermath. He would step in after the partygoers had left, wearing gloves to handle the mess. This wasn't just about leftover bottles or crumbs. It was about cleaning up the wreckage of a night fueled by excess, lust, and chaos. Condoms, used drugs, and discarded paraphernalia were part of the debris. Paul's role in this world wasn't just to facilitate it, but to make sure it went off without a hitch and then make it all disappear, leaving no trace of the depravity that had unfolded. These nights, described by Paul as Wild King nights, were held regularly and at Diddy's demand. The name alone suggested something outrageous, something outside the bounds of normal social gatherings. Diddy's obsession with control extended to these events, where he would host a mixture of women, alcohol, and illicit substances. It wasn't just about indulgence. It was about power, Diddy's power to orchestrate, to manipulate, and to control every moment of these drug-fueled gatherings, and Paul, as his assistant, was an unwilling participant in the design and cleanup of this twisted form of entertainment. What makes this even more disturbing is the nature of the people involved. Paul testified that, while Jane, an anonymous woman at the center of the trial, was a consistent figure at these nights, Diddy wasn't exclusive in his choices. Multiple women came and went, each playing their part in a dehumanizing cycle of consumption and exploitation. But one of the most jaw-dropping moments came when, March 25, 2024, a day that should have marked the end of Brendan Paul's tumultuous tenure as Sean Diddy Combs' assistant, instead became the beginning of a personal and legal nightmare. It was supposed to be just another day. Paul was on his way to catch a flight to begin a long-awaited family holiday, an escape from the exhausting life he had been living. But things took a sharp turn at Miami Opa-locka Airport when he was arrested for cocaine possession. What started as a routine airport check quickly spiraled into a terrifying ordeal. Paul was stopped by security and found in possession of cocaine, a drug he claimed was not his. But that wasn't the end of it. The real shocker came when Paul made a decision that would change everything. He chose not to implicate Diddy. During the arrest, as Paul sat facing the authorities, the weight of loyalty to the man he had served for over a year crushed him. Despite the fact that the cocaine was found in his possession, Paul refused to admit that it came from Diddy. He chose silence over truth, loyalty over honesty. He made a choice that nearly cost him his freedom and his future. "I didn't tell them it was Diddy's," Paul admitted in his testimony. "I kept quiet out of loyalty. I couldn't betray him. It was a decision that would haunt him, one that seemed noble at the time but would later reveal the dark consequences of his misplaced trust." For Paul, Diddy wasn't just a boss. He was a figure of power and influence, someone who had given him opportunities and shown him a glimpse of the high life. In a moment of fear and confusion, Paul chose to protect Diddy, despite the looming consequences. But that decision wasn't without its risks. The authorities could have easily pressed charges, and Paul could have faced severe legal consequences. As he sat in the police station, trying to make sense of what was happening, he had to wrestle with the reality of his choice. Would his loyalty to Diddy be enough to keep him from the legal repercussions that were now closing in on him? He didn't know, but he chose to remain silent. The charges were eventually dropped, but the emotional and mental toll of the entire experience lingered. Paul walked away from the airport that day free from legal consequences, but with a heavy heart. His loyalty to Diddy had nearly cost him everything: his job, his reputation, and his future. It was a stark reminder of the complex, often toxic relationship between them. But loyalty isn't always enough when you're caught in a dangerous web. Throughout Brendan Paul's time working for Sean Diddy Combs, there was an undeniable complexity to their relationship, a mix of admiration, loyalty, and disillusionment. On the surface, Paul had every reason to be grateful. Working for one of the world's most successful moguls wasn't just an opportunity, it was a dream. Diddy wasn't just an employer, he was an icon, a man who had shaped the music industry and built an empire. For someone like Paul, who had grown up in Cleveland, Ohio, this was the kind of chance most people would kill for. It wasn't just about the paycheck, it was about the proximity to greatness, the access to a world of wealth, fame, and influence. And yet, as Paul worked closely with Diddy, something began to shift. The admiration that once fueled his ambition slowly turned to confusion and, eventually, resentment. Paul realized that the man he had once looked up to had a dark side, one that not only clashed with his values, but also forced him to compromise his moral compass. The longer Paul stayed in Diddy's orbit, the more he saw how toxic and manipulative the environment was. It was in the moments when the cameras weren't rolling and the public eye wasn't focused on Diddy that the real ugliness revealed itself. The drug use, the erratic behavior, the power dynamics, and, most disturbingly, the exploitation of people around him. These were all things Paul had a front row seat to. In the beginning, Paul made excuses. He justified Diddy's actions. He told himself that Diddy was under pressure, that this was just part of the lifestyle. But as time went on, the truth became undeniable. Paul's internal conflict became more pronounced. He had come to admire Diddy as a businessman, as someone who had built an empire against all odds. But now, he found himself questioning everything he had believed in. Was Diddy the genius he thought he was, or was he just a man using his power and influence to manipulate everyone around him? The boundary between admiration and disgust began to blur. The moments when Paul had to watch Diddy use drugs, manipulate people, and exercise brutal control over his assistants were the hardest. Paul had grown up believing in hard work, loyalty, and respect, but Diddy's world didn't operate on those values. It was a world where success came at the expense of others, and loyalty was expected but not reciprocated. The longer Paul stayed, the more he realized that the man he had once admired had deeply unethical practices. And worse, Paul found himself complicit, caught in the web of power, fear, and loyalty. Despite everything, Paul's loyalty to Diddy was not easy to break. It was a loyalty that had been built over time, strengthened by Diddy's mentorship, however toxic it might have been. It was the same loyalty that led Paul to protect Diddy when the authorities came knocking at the airport, a decision that nearly cost him his future. But that loyalty wasn't without its consequences. Every day, Paul struggled with the knowledge that he was enabling the very things he was beginning to despise. The internal battle was exhausting, tearing him apart from the inside. By the time Paul took the witness stand, the weight of that internal struggle had become impossible to ignore. He had to reckon with his role in the chaos, how he had allowed himself to be manipulated, and how his silence in the face of Diddy's actions had contributed to the pain and destruction. The person he had once admired was no longer just a mogul. He was a symbol of everything Paul had come to despise about power, greed, and control. But as the trial unfolds, more truths are coming to light. As the courtroom drama unfolds, the scandal surrounding Sean Diddy Combs continues to unravel with shocking revelations. The once untouchable mogul, celebrated for his rise from humble beginnings to global icon, now finds himself at the center of one of the most explosive trials in recent history. The secrets Paul exposed are nothing short of damning. From drug use to exploitation, manipulation, and moral compromise, Diddy's empire, once synonymous with success, is now stained with accusations that have sent shockwaves through the entertainment world. The testimony of Brendan Paul, his former assistant, has shattered the carefully crafted image Diddy spent decades building. What was once a business built on the backs of hard work and determination is now seen through a different lens, a lens tainted by abuse of power and disregard for the well-being of those closest to him. The long hours, the toxic demands, the use of illicit substances, all of it paints a portrait of a man who thrived on control, not just in business but in every aspect of his life. For Paul, the decision to testify against Diddy has come at a great cost. He's had to confront the reality that the man he once admired was not the visionary he believed him to be. The loyalty he showed, even at the risk of his freedom, speaks to the emotional complexity of the relationship between them. But now, as the trial presses on, the truth can no longer be hidden, and the damage to Diddy's public image is irreversible. The empire he built on the foundation of music, fashion, and wealth is now facing a crisis of credibility, and with each new revelation, the future of his brand, his business, and his legacy becomes increasingly uncertain. With all this on the table, what does the future hold for the hip-hop mogul and his empire? Will Diddy be able to weather this storm, or has the truth finally caught up to him? As the trial continues, it's clear that the fall of one of hip-hop's most powerful figures is far from over. The question remains, can he rebuild, or will this scandal forever define his legacy?